For 3 weeks, former Navy SEAL Caleb Mercer hadn't slept through a single night. Every morning at exactly 2:18 a.m., Havoc, the German shepherd who had once survived combat missions beside him, would jolt him awake at any cost. A cold nose pressed against his chest, a paw dragging at the blanket, sharp scratches against his arm.
boy,
No
Havoc.
veterinarian could
You're
find
doing
anything
great.
wrong. No canine handler
We're
could
almost
explain the
done here.
behavior. As exhaustion began destroying his work, his relationships, and the life he had rebuilt after the military, Caleb made a decision he had sworn he would never make about the partner who had once helped bring him home alive. But only days later, a shocking truth would force him to confront something far worse than a troubled dog. For 3 weeks, Havoc hadn't been ruining his life. He had been fighting to save it. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Early autumn arrived quietly in Fort Collins, Colorado. The mornings came cooler than they had a few weeks earlier, carrying the scent of dry leaves from the cottonwoods that lined sections of the Poudre River. By the time most people were pouring their first cup of coffee, Caleb Mercer had usually been awake for more than an hour. At 43, he had settled into the kind of routine that rarely changed. He left home at the same time, parked in the same corner of the maintenance yard, and spent his workdays inspecting electrical systems that powered warehouses, manufacturing facilities, and distribution centers across northern Colorado. The routine suited him. Life had been unpredictable enough before. His small house sat on a quiet residential street where people still waved from driveways and stopped to talk about weather, football, or rising property taxes. The place wasn't remarkable, but it felt stable, and stability had become something Caleb valued more than excitement. Most evenings followed a familiar pattern. He returned home around 5:30, changed clothes, took Havoc for a walk, ate dinner, and spent an hour or two fixing something in the garage or watching the evening news before turning in for the night. Havoc followed those routines as naturally as breathing. The German shepherd had been with him longer than anyone else still in his life. There had been a time when the two of them moved through villages in Afghanistan instead of neighborhoods in Colorado. Back then, Havoc wore protective gear, traveled in military vehicles, and worked beside men whose lives depended on his instincts. Years later, the missions were gone, the uniforms were packed away, and the deployments had become stories that rarely left Caleb's head. Yet some habits remained unchanged. Havoc still walked slightly ahead when entering unfamiliar spaces. Caleb still found himself checking exits in restaurants without realizing it. Some things never fully left. On a Tuesday night in September, Caleb woke suddenly and found Havoc standing beside the bed. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:18 a.m. For a few seconds he stared through the darkness, trying to understand why he was awake. Havoc leaned forward and nudged his chest with his nose. Caleb reached down, scratched behind the dog's ears, and mumbled a few tired words before rolling onto his side. Within minutes, he was asleep again. The next morning, he barely remembered it. The same thing happened the following night. And then again the night after that. Each time, Caleb woke to find Havoc standing close to the bed, watching him with unusual concentration. The dog wasn't asking to go outside. His water bowl was full. His food remained untouched until morning. Nothing in his behavior suggested excitement, anxiety, or discomfort. He simply refused to leave Caleb asleep. After 4 consecutive nights, the pattern became impossible to ignore. After 7, it began affecting the rest of his life. The first changes were small enough to dismiss. Caleb needed an extra cup of coffee during the afternoon. He found himself reading the same maintenance report twice before realizing he had stopped paying attention halfway through. One morning, he drove 3 miles before remembering he had left his lunch sitting on the kitchen counter. The mistakes irritated him more than they worried him. For most of his adult life, being dependable had been part of his identity. During his military years, people trusted him to make decisions under pressure. In his civilian job, supervisors gave him difficult assignments because they knew he would handle them properly. Losing focus felt unfamiliar, almost like wearing someone else's boots. One Thursday afternoon, his friend and coworker Nate Holloway found him sitting alone in the break room. "You look like hell," Nate said as he poured coffee into a stained company mug. Caleb glanced up from the table. "Good to see you too. I'm serious." Nate sat across from him and studied his face for a moment. "You sleeping at all?" Caleb let out a tired breath. "Not much. Work stress? I wish it was that simple." For the next several minutes, he explained what had been happening. Nate listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the older man leaned back in his chair and frowned. "So every night?" "Every night. Same time, close enough that it's getting creepy." Nate nodded slowly. The conversation lingered in Caleb's mind for the rest of the day. That evening, he paid closer attention to Havoc than usual. The dog spent part of the afternoon sleeping near the sliding glass door where sunlight spilled across the floor. Later, he carried a tennis ball into the backyard and waited patiently until Caleb threw it. During their evening walk, he greeted a golden retriever from 2 houses down and sat automatically when Caleb stopped at an intersection. Everything about him appeared normal. If someone had met Havoc that afternoon, they would have seen a healthy, retired working dog enjoying a peaceful life. Nothing more. That was what made the night so difficult to understand. As the second week approached, Caleb began watching the clock before bed. He found himself wondering whether Havoc would do it again and feeling annoyed that he was even asking the question. The anticipation was almost worse than the interruption itself. At 2:18 a.m., Havoc woke him again. This time, the dog placed a paw against the mattress before nudging him awake. Caleb sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood remained silent beneath the glow of distant streetlights. Havoc stood perfectly still. His ears were forward. His eyes never left Caleb. For reasons he couldn't explain, the moment left Caleb unsettled long after he lay back down. The following morning, fatigue followed him through every hour of the day. He misplaced a maintenance schedule, forgot to return a phone call, and spent several minutes searching for a tool that turned out to be hanging exactly where it belonged. By the time he drove home that evening, the familiar comfort of his routine felt slightly out of reach. Havoc greeted him at the front door exactly as he always did. The dog carried one of his old toys in his mouth and wagged his tail once before walking toward the kitchen. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Yet somewhere between 2:18 in the morning and the exhaustion waiting for him every afternoon, something had changed. Caleb just didn't know what it was. Before we continue with what the story reveals, don't forget to like and subscribe. By the beginning of the second week, Caleb Mercer had stopped hoping the problem would simply disappear. The first few nights had been strange. The next several had become exhausting. Now the interruptions had settled into his life like an unwelcome routine, arriving every night with the same stubborn consistency. He still woke at 2:18 a.m. to find Havoc standing beside the bed, and every morning he found himself a little more tired than the day before. What troubled him most was the growing gap between what he experienced at night and what he saw during the day. Nothing about Havoc seemed wrong. The dog's appetite remained strong. His energy never wavered. His obedience was as sharp as it had always been. If a stranger had spent an afternoon with him, they would have assumed he was one of the healthiest retired working dogs they had ever met. That certainty made Caleb increasingly uneasy. A problem could be solved once it was identified. This felt different. Every explanation he came up with collapsed the moment he looked at the evidence. One evening after work, he extended their usual walk from 30 minutes to nearly 2 hours. The route carried them through neighborhood trails, along open fields, and eventually toward a section of river where fishermen stood quietly in the fading light. By the time they returned home, Havoc appeared pleasantly tired. Caleb felt encouraged. The following night, Havoc woke him at 2:18 a.m. The next day, Caleb bought a different brand of food. Nothing changed. He inspected the backyard fence, checked for signs of animals passing through during the night, and replaced a motion sensor light that occasionally flickered near the garage. He examined the heating system, tested smoke detectors, and even spent half a Saturday checking window seals, after convincing himself some distant sound might be disturbing the dog. Nothing explained Havoc's behavior. The dog continued waking him every night. At work, the lack of sleep was becoming harder to hide. Caleb had always been known as the steady one. If equipment failed unexpectedly, supervisors called him. If a problem required patience and attention to detail, it usually ended up on his schedule. Now he found himself making mistakes that would have embarrassed the younger version of himself. One morning he arrived at the wrong facility. On another day, he spent 10 minutes searching for a set of insulated gloves that were already hanging from his belt. The incidents were minor, but they accumulated. More than once he caught Nate watching him with quiet concern. Late one afternoon, while sitting alone in his truck before driving home, Caleb scrolled through his contacts and stopped at a name he hadn't called in months. Logan Pierce. The two men had served together for years. Unlike Caleb, Logan had spent much of his military career working directly with military dogs. If anyone could explain what was happening, it would be him. 2 days later, Logan arrived carrying a worn duffel bag and a notebook. Havoc recognized him immediately. The dog's tail moved once before he walked forward and pressed his head briefly against Logan's leg. "Well," Logan said with a smile, "he still remembers me." The visit lasted most of the afternoon. Logan observed Havoc inside the house and outside in the yard. He tested hearing responses, reaction times, scent recognition, and command recall. At one point, he hid training aids around the property simply to see whether age had affected the dog's abilities. Nothing unusual appeared. Hours passed. The notebook remained mostly empty. Near sunset, the two men sat on the back patio while Havoc rested nearby. Logan looked down at the dog for several seconds before speaking. "I've seen dogs develop anxiety." Caleb waited. "I've seen dogs react to changes in routine, health problems, injuries, even things their owners never noticed." And Logan shook his head, "And I've never seen anything quite like this." The answer landed heavily because it came from someone Caleb trusted. If Logan couldn't explain it, who could? A few days later, Caleb scheduled an appointment with a veterinarian recommended by another former handler. The clinic performed a thorough examination. Blood work came back normal. Cardiovascular screening showed no concerns. Neurological responses appeared healthy for a dog his age. The veterinarian reviewed every result twice before finally leaning back in her chair. "If you hadn't described the nighttime behavior," she admitted, "I would tell you this is an exceptionally healthy dog." Caleb drove home, feeling more frustrated than reassured. By then, exhaustion had started changing him in ways he disliked. He became impatient more easily. Small inconveniences felt larger than they should. Even simple conversations required effort. One night, after another difficult day at work, he made a decision that immediately felt wrong. For the first time since Havoc had entered his life, Caleb closed the bedroom door and left the dog outside. The silence lasted less than an hour. At exactly 2:18 a.m., scratching erupted on the other side of the door. Not a few polite taps, persistent scratching, then pacing, then low whining. Caleb buried his face in the pillow and tried to ignore it. The sound continued. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. By then, neither of them was sleeping. Finally, Caleb threw back the blankets, crossed the room, and opened the door. Havoc entered immediately. He didn't run around the room or jump onto the bed. Instead, he moved straight toward Caleb, stood beside him, and stared up at his face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The behavior lasted only a few moments before the dog settled near the bed. Caleb stood there longer. Something about the interaction stayed with him. The following evening brought an unexpected visitor. Walter Boone appeared carrying a small container of homemade chili and the casual confidence of someone who had lived in the neighborhood long enough to walk into conversations without needing an invitation. At 72, Walter had become the closest thing Caleb had to family in Fort Collins. The retired firefighter lived 3 houses away and seemed to know every resident within a half-mile radius. The two men ate dinner together while Havoc stretched out near the kitchen table. Walter watched the dog for most of the evening. They talked about football. They discussed fishing conditions in the mountains. At one point, Havoc wandered over and rested his head on Walter's knee. The older man smiled. "He's still the same dog I've known for years." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's the problem." Walter looked confused. "What do you mean?" Caleb glanced toward Havoc. The German Shepherd was lying comfortably on the floor, completely relaxed. Looking at him now, no one would believe what happened after midnight. For the rest of the evening, Walter saw nothing unusual. Neither did Caleb. Yet as bedtime approached, a familiar feeling settled over him. The veterinarian couldn't explain it. Logan couldn't explain it. Walter couldn't see it. And with every failed attempt to understand what was happening, Caleb found himself trusting his own judgment a little less than he had the day before. Somewhere between the man he had been in Afghanistan and the man staring at his bedroom ceiling every night at 2:18 a.m., certainty had begun to slip away. The third week began with a mistake that could have ended much worse than it did. Caleb was working at a distribution facility on the outskirts of Fort Collins, inspecting electrical panels that powered part of the loading system. The morning had already been long. He remembered waking twice during the night. He remembered staring at the ceiling afterward, listening to the quiet sounds of the house while waiting for sleep to return. Beyond that, the hours felt blurred together. Near the end of the inspection, he reached toward a panel that should have been isolated from power. Should have been. Something made him stop. Maybe training, maybe luck, maybe the last surviving instinct of a man who had spent years learning that small mistakes could become permanent ones. A second check revealed that the lockout procedure hadn't been completed correctly. The panel was still live. Nothing happened. Nobody was injured. But the realization sat heavily in Caleb's stomach. A few years earlier, he would have caught the problem immediately. Later that afternoon, his supervisor asked him to step into a small office overlooking the maintenance yard. The conversation remained respectful, but it was direct. "We need to talk about what's going on." Caleb already knew why. The missed inspection, the forgotten paperwork, the increasing number of small mistakes. Now this. His supervisor folded his hands on the desk. "You're one of the most reliable people I've ever worked with, Caleb. That's exactly why I'm saying this." He paused. "You can't keep going like this." The words stayed with Caleb all the way home. For the first time since this began, he found himself wondering whether the problem had grown beyond an inconvenience. The following evening, Walter Boone stopped by after dinner. The older man listened patiently while Caleb explained everything that had happened during the past 3 weeks. When he finished, Walter sat quietly for a moment. Then he offered something Caleb hadn't considered. "Let him stay with me tomorrow night." Caleb looked up. Walter shrugged. "If he's reacting to something about your house, we'll find out." It sounded reasonable. At that point, nearly everything sounded reasonable. The next afternoon, Caleb dropped Havoc off at Walter's house. The German Shepherd settled in almost immediately. Walter called around dinner time to report that everything was going well. The dog had spent part of the afternoon following him around the yard. Later, he stretched out beside the fireplace while Walter watched a baseball game. He accepted treats, obeyed commands, and behaved exactly the way everyone expected him to behave. For several hours, Caleb allowed himself to believe they might finally learn something. At 11:47 p.m., his phone rang. Walter rarely called that late. Caleb answered immediately. "Everything okay?" There was a pause. Then Walter sighed. "I don't know." "What happened?" "He's been standing by the front door for almost 2 hours. Caleb sat up. Walter continued. "He won't settle down. He keeps pacing back and forth. Every few minutes he scratches at the door and then goes back to staring outside." Caleb listened quietly. The older man's voice carried genuine confusion. "I've never seen him act like this." "Is he sick?" "No, scared." "I don't think so." Walter hesitated. "He just looks like he wants to go home." Neither man said much after that. There wasn't much left to say. The experiment had failed. The following morning, Caleb picked Havoc up before work. The dog climbed into the truck and settled into the passenger seat, as if nothing unusual had happened. The ride home was silent. Days passed. The interruptions continued. The exhaustion deepened. And somewhere beneath the frustration, another feeling began growing. Fear. Not fear of Havoc. Fear that he was running out of answers. The decision came 3 days later. Even years afterward, Caleb would remember exactly where he was standing when he made it. He was in the kitchen. The clock above the stove showed 5:36 p.m. Havoc was lying near the back door. And Caleb was tired. Tired in a way that felt larger than sleep. The nearest retired military K-9 Transition and Rehabilitation Center sat outside Colorado Springs. The facility had a strong reputation. Former handlers trusted the staff. The dogs received proper care. If Havoc truly needed help that Caleb could no longer provide, It was the best place available. That was how he justified the decision. The drive south took nearly 2 hours. The staff members were kind, professional, understanding. One of them spent nearly 30 minutes talking with Caleb about Havoc's service history. Another explained the evaluation process. Nobody judged him. That somehow made it harder. When the time came to leave, Havoc remained seated beside Caleb. The dog looked up once. Waiting, Caleb scratched behind his ears. Then he walked away. The drive back to Fort Collins felt longer. The house felt larger and far quieter. The first night without Havoc should have brought relief. Instead, Caleb found himself listening for sounds that never came. 2 days later, his phone rang while he was eating lunch in the company parking lot. The call came from the center. The woman on the line sounded concerned. "We wanted to give you an update." Caleb immediately knew something was wrong. The staff had observed behavior they couldn't explain. Havoc was barely eating. He showed little interest in the other dogs. Most of the day he sat near the main entrance. At night he refused to settle. Several staff members had heard him pacing for hours after lights out. The woman paused. "He keeps watching the door." The words hit harder than Caleb expected. After ending the call, he remained in the truck for a long time. The parking lot outside continued moving normally. Employees walked between buildings. Delivery trucks arrived and departed. Somewhere nearby, a forklift alarm sounded briefly and then disappeared. Life continued, yet all Caleb could think about was a German shepherd sitting beside a door waiting for someone who had left him behind. That evening he drove to Colorado Springs. The reunion itself was simple. No dramatic scene, no barking, no running. Havoc walked toward him, stopped, and leaned his weight lightly against Caleb's leg, the same way he had done countless times before. On the drive home, the mountains faded into darkness beyond the windshield. For several miles, neither of them moved. Then, somewhere north of Castle Rock, Caleb felt tears running down his face. The last time he had cried had been shortly after leaving the military. He kept both hands on the steering wheel. The highway lights slid past one after another, and for the first time since this strange ordeal had begun, he realized he had spent weeks treating the situation like a problem to solve instead of a partner trying to tell him something. The thought stayed with him after they returned home. That night, he placed a notebook beside the bed. Before turning off the light, he wrote down the date. Then he added the time he went to sleep. When Havoc woke him later, he wrote that down too. The next morning, he recorded breakfast. The following evening, he recorded how tired he felt after work. By the end of the week, the notebook contained pages of observations that probably meant nothing. Yet Caleb continued writing, because after 3 weeks of failed explanations, he had run out of almost everything else. By the time October arrived, the notebook beside Caleb's bed had become part of his nightly routine. At first, the entries had felt pointless. Most of them were little more than scattered observations, written by a tired man searching for patterns that might not exist. He recorded what time he went to bed, how many times Havoc woke him, what he ate for dinner, how demanding work had been that day, and anything else that seemed remotely relevant. The pages accumulated quickly. 10 days became 12, then 14, and still no obvious answer appeared. One Saturday morning, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and began reading through everything from the beginning. Outside, a light wind moved through the trees behind the house. Havoc slept near the sliding glass door, stretched across a patch of sunlight that had found its way across the floor. Caleb turned page after page. Most of the entries seemed meaningless. Then he noticed something. The nights weren't all equally bad. On days when work had been relatively easy, Havoc usually woke him once or twice before settling down. The interruptions were frustrating but manageable. On days when Caleb returned home exhausted after handling emergency repairs, climbing ladders for hours, or spending an entire shift troubleshooting complex electrical failures, Havoc's behavior became noticeably more intense. Those were the nights when the dog woke him 4 or 5 times. Those were the nights when Havoc paced around the bed, nudged his chest repeatedly, and refused to settle for long. The pattern wasn't dramatic enough to explain anything, but it was the first thing in weeks that resembled a clue. Caleb stared at the notebook for a long time. The observation raised a question he had been avoiding. What if Havoc wasn't reacting to something wrong with himself? What if he was reacting to something happening to Caleb? The thought followed him to work on Monday. That afternoon, he was sitting in the break room when Nate dropped into the chair across from him. The conversation drifted between football scores, weekend plans, and a maintenance project scheduled for later that week. Then Nate glanced toward Caleb's wrist. "You still wearing that thing?" Caleb looked down. The black Garmin Tactics Delta had been part of his life for years. He had purchased it shortly before his final deployment and had worn it through military service, long hikes, fishing trips, and countless ordinary workdays afterward. "Still works," Caleb said. Nate nodded. "I forgot those things track sleep now." The comment almost passed unnoticed. Then Caleb paused. "So do most smartwatches." "Yeah, but yours tracks a lot more than most." Nate shrugged. "Might be worth looking at." The suggestion stayed with him during the drive home. That evening, after dinner, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and his phone beside it. The process took longer than expected because he hadn't looked at the health data in years. Eventually, the information appeared on the screen. Rows of graphs, heart rate data, sleep metrics, pulse oximeter readings, historical records stretching back months. The longer he looked, the quieter the room seemed to become. Several nights showed the same pattern. Around the times Havoc woke him, the graphs revealed abrupt spikes in heart rate. Oxygen levels dropped sharply before recovering. Sleep cycles ended suddenly and repeatedly. The events appeared again and again, different nights. Different dates, similar results. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He wasn't looking at an explanation. He was looking at evidence that something unusual was happening while he slept. For the first time, the notebook and the dog's behavior seemed connected to something measurable. The next morning, he scheduled an appointment with his doctor. 2 days later, he sat inside an examination room with the notebook resting on his lap and several pages of printed Garmin data spread across the desk. The physician spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing everything. The room remained quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper. Finally, the doctor set the reports down. "I don't think this is a problem with your dog." Caleb almost laughed. Neither of them had expected that sentence. The doctor continued, "These oxygen drops concern me more than anything else." He pointed towards several entries, and these interruptions are happening repeatedly. "Do you know what's causing them?" "No." The answer was honest. "But I think we need to investigate your sleep." The doctor explained the next step. Caleb would complete a home sleep study using specialized monitoring equipment. The device would record breathing patterns, oxygen levels, and other physiological data during sleep. The test felt strange. For 2 nights, he slept with sensors attached to his body while Havoc remained nearby. The German Shepherd seemed unusually attentive throughout the process. Twice during the first night, Caleb woke to find the dog sitting beside the bed watching him. The second night passed much the same way. Then the equipment went back. Several days later, the results arrived. Caleb sat across from the doctor as the report was reviewed. The explanation began with medical terminology. Then it became painfully simple. He suffered from severe obstructive sleep apnea. While sleeping, his airway repeatedly collapsed and restricted airflow. The report showed more than 30 significant breathing disruptions per hour. Some episodes lasted 22 seconds. Others stretched beyond 40 seconds before his body forced itself awake enough to restore oxygen. The longest recorded event lasted 41 seconds. What unsettled Caleb most wasn't the duration. It was the fact that he remembered none of it. The doctor explained that untreated sleep apnea increased the risk of stroke, cardiovascular problems, dangerous fatigue, workplace accidents, and long-term health complications. As the conversation continued, Caleb found himself staring at a section of the report. More than 30 events per hour. Night after night, week after week. The room felt very still. 3 weeks earlier, he had believed Havoc was creating a problem. 2 weeks earlier, he had questioned his own judgment. 1 week earlier, he had left the dog at a rehabilitation center because he could no longer understand what was happening. Now the pieces finally aligned. The pacing, the nudging, the repeated awakenings, the nights that were worse after physically exhausting days. The dog's refusal to leave him alone. Havoc had never been trying to keep him awake. He had been trying to wake him up. The distinction changed everything. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he lowered his eyes toward the floor where Havoc lay quietly beside his chair. The dog looked up. The same steady eyes, the same patient expression, the same partner who had spent weeks trying to tell him something that no human had been able to explain. And for the first time since all of this began, Caleb understood what he had been looking at every night when he opened his eyes at 2:18 in the morning. The respiratory therapist spent nearly an hour explaining the equipment. By the end of the appointment, Caleb had learned more about sleep than he had in the previous 43 years of his life. The machine itself was smaller than he expected. The mask felt awkward. The tubing seemed unnecessarily complicated. Nothing about it felt natural. Yet the numbers from the sleep study had been impossible to ignore. More than 30 breathing disruptions every hour. Dozens of moments each night when his body struggled to get enough air. Weeks of fatigue that now made sense. The therapist assured him that adjustment took time. Most people needed days or even weeks before sleeping comfortably with the device. Caleb nodded and listened. Part of him was still thinking about Havoc. That evening, after dinner, he assembled everything beside the bed while the German Shepherd watched from his usual spot near the window. The machine hummed softly once it was switched on. For a while, the unfamiliar sensation made sleep difficult. Eventually, exhaustion won. When Caleb opened his eyes again, sunlight was already filtering through the curtains. For several seconds, he remained still. The room felt different. Not dramatically different, just quieter, clearer, as though a constant background noise had finally disappeared. Then he noticed the clock. 7:01 a.m. His gaze shifted toward the floor. Havoc was asleep at the foot of the bed, not sitting watch. Not pacing, not staring, simply sleeping. Caleb couldn't remember the last time that had happened. The realization stayed with him through the rest of the morning. During breakfast, he found himself watching the dog more than usual. 3 weeks of memories kept returning. The scratching at the bedroom door. The restless pacing. The frustration. The arguments he had carried on with an animal that couldn't explain itself. Most of all, he remembered the rehabilitation center. He remembered walking away. He remembered Havoc sitting quietly beside the staff member, waiting for instructions that never came. At the time, Caleb had convinced himself he was doing the responsible thing. Now he understood how little he had actually known. The following weeks brought changes that appeared gradually enough to seem almost accidental. He woke up feeling rested. The afternoon exhaustion began to disappear. Coffee became a preference again rather than a necessity. At work, concentration returned. Small mistakes stopped happening. One morning, while reviewing a complicated maintenance schedule, Caleb realized he had completed the entire task without rereading the same paragraph 3 times. The thought made him smile. A month earlier, he would have considered that normal. Now it felt like progress. Other people noticed too. Nate was the first. The 2 men were walking across the maintenance yard when Nate glanced sideways at him. "You look better." Caleb laughed. "I didn't realize I looked that bad." "You did." "Thanks, I'm serious." Nate pointed toward him. "You're standing differently." The comment sounded ridiculous at first. Then Caleb realized what Nate meant. The constant fatigue had disappeared from his posture. For weeks, he had been moving through life carrying exhaustion he didn't understand. Without it, simple things felt easier. The improvements continued. A follow-up appointment confirmed that treatment was working. The data looked better. Oxygen levels remained stable. Sleep quality improved significantly. The risks discussed during the original diagnosis were beginning to decrease. The doctor's satisfaction was obvious. Caleb's relief was quieter. The greatest change wasn't physical. It had something to do with perspective. For years, he had thought of loyalty in practical terms. Showing up when someone needed help, keeping promises, standing beside people during difficult moments. The military had reinforced those ideas until they became part of his character. Yet the previous month had revealed another side of loyalty. Sometimes loyalty looked inconvenient. Sometimes it arrived in forms that were easy to misunderstand. Sometimes it interrupted sleep, ruined routines, and refused to back down even when it was punished for trying. One afternoon, several weeks after beginning treatment, Caleb returned to the clinic for another review. The appointment was nearly over when the physician closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "I'm curious about something." Caleb looked up. "What finally convinced you to come see me?" The question lingered in the room. Technically, there were several possible answers. The notebook, the Garmin watch, the exhaustion, the warnings from people around him, all of them had played a role. But none of them had started the process. Caleb looked down. Havoc was lying beside the chair as he always did during appointments. The German Shepherd had spent most of the visit sleeping peacefully. At that moment, he opened one eye and glanced up. Caleb smiled. "My partner." The doctor looked around the room. "Which one?" The smile widened slightly. "The one with 4 legs." The physician laughed softly. Then he looked down at Havoc and shook his head. "Smart dog." Caleb considered correcting him. Smart wasn't quite the right word. Smart dogs followed commands. Smart dogs solved problems. Smart dogs performed remarkable tasks. What Havoc had done felt different. The dog had noticed a danger that nobody else could see. Then he had spent 3 exhausting weeks trying to warn someone too stubborn to understand. A few days later, Caleb and Havoc returned to a trail they had walked together for years. The path wound through open grassland north of town, before climbing gradually toward a ridge overlooking the valley. Autumn had deepened since the strange nights began. The trees carried more gold than green now, and the distant mountains wore fresh traces of snow along their highest peaks. The morning remained cool and quiet. Havoc moved beside him at an easy pace, and neither of them seemed to be in any hurry. At one point, Caleb stopped and looked across the valley, stretching toward the horizon. The view was the same one he had seen through countless seasons. The same trail, the same mountains, the same dog walking beside him. Yet something had changed, not in Havoc, in himself. For weeks, Caleb had mistaken a warning for a problem. He had treated concern as inconvenience and persistence as disobedience. Only later had he discovered what stood behind those midnight interruptions. The realization stayed with him as they resumed walking. Some forms of loyalty announce themselves loudly. Others arrive quietly and refuse to leave. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones we spend weeks trying not to listen to. Havoc glanced back briefly before continuing down the trail. Caleb followed. This time he understood exactly what the dog had been trying to tell him. Even now, every so often, around 2 in the morning, Caleb wakes to find Havoc sitting beside the bed, just watching, making sure he is okay. And when he is satisfied that Caleb is safe, he curls back up near the foot of the bed and sleeps. There's one part of this story I keep coming back to. It isn't the diagnosis. It isn't the sleep study. It isn't even the moment Caleb finally learned what was wrong. It's the fact that for 3 weeks, a dog kept showing up in the middle of the night, trying to solve a problem he couldn't explain. Think about that for a moment. Havoc had no words, no way to tell Caleb what he was noticing. All he could do was nudge him awake, pace beside the bed, and refuse to give up. From Caleb's perspective, it looked like a problem. From Havoc's perspective, it was probably the most important job he had ever been given. That makes me wonder how many important things in life first arrive disguised as inconveniences. And here's something worth considering. If your dog has suddenly started waking you up during the night, especially if it's a new behavior, don't immediately dismiss it. It may be nothing at all, but it may also be worth paying attention to your health. Dogs notice changes in breathing, movement, scent, and routine long before most people do. Sometimes they're reacting to something we haven't noticed yet. This story is fictional, but the loyalty, concern, and human experiences behind it are very real. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has a dog ever alerted you to something unusual or done something you only understood later? Share your story, memory, prayer, or experience in the comments. And if you enjoy grounded stories about real human emotions, loyal dogs, and the unexpected ways our lives intersect, please like and subscribe. As for me, I keep thinking about that quiet bedroom after everything was finally understood. No scratching at the door, no pacing, just a tired old dog sleeping peacefully, knowing the person he loved was finally breathing easy again.